Hi, so I'm Caroline Lucarelli, and this summer, like Sarah said, I had the pleasure of working with Dr. Reed Hansen at Auburn University College of Veterinary Medicine. So one of my 4 branches of my internship was spent doing clinics. We viewed horses anywhere from orthopedic lamenesses to gastrointestinal problems, and this was a group that I worked with Dr. Weatherall, Dr. Zetterstrom, and another doctor, Dr. Codwell. And just a disclaimer, there are some very graphic photos lying ahead, so if you're squeamish, I will not be offended if you have to step out or look away. So one of our toughest cases that we were presented with was Fiona, a 19-year-old Belgian draft mare who presented with a strangulating lipoma, which is when your small intestines wrap around itself, creating necrosed bowel tissue. From there, she was diagnosed with septic peritonitis 5 days post-op of her laparotomy, and from there we placed an abdominal drain to drain all the infected bacteria. And as you can see here, this is her drain draining into that bucket. At the time, we thought this was just abdominal fluid, but from the necropsy report, there was a perforation in her small intestine, so this was actually all small intestinal fluid. She had a bunch of overwhelming problems as well. She was endotoxemic, so her blood was toxic. She had overwhelming amounts of E. coli in her abdominal cavity. She had bilateral phlebitis of both the jugular veins, which meant we could no longer place a catheter in her jugular veins to give her fluids. We had to go into the thoracic vein through her rib cage. She was also hyperproteinemic, which meant she was low in protein, which was not helping with anything, and her neutrophil bands were extremely elevated. Bands are basically immature white blood cells, so when your body's pumping out white cells that aren't ready to fight infections yet, you know that the infection has become really severe. And then down here, she was also azotemic, which had to do with her creatinine levels that jumped from 1.4 to 2.7 overnight, indicating kidney failure, along with her albumin levels. So sadly, she was euthanized, but it was really cool, all the stuff that we were able to do to help her up until that point. This was some other stuff that I observed. Up here was a sarcoid removal. This was a staple removal of a physis in a foal, and down here was an MRI of a horse. So on to the second part this was the main reason why I went to Auburn, because Dr. Hansen does amazing cartilage research. The goal of our cartilage research was to create a better synthetic joint for humans and also for horses. The prosthetic joint that is used in common knee replacements now does not provide proper load transfer, so it is better than your arthritic joints, but it's not as good as it could be. So we started by harvesting our samples from the state diagnostic lab. We harvest them from cadavers. And so here, these pictures, you can see the osteoarthritis affecting the articular cartilage in here. And so we would harvest them, and then from there, over here is our femur trochlear ridge sample, and then this is our radial carpi sample. They would be taken to the engineering lab on Auburn's main campus to have tests run. So we would be placing them in a turbometer, shown over here. The turbometer measures coefficient of friction at each point. And we used 6 different balls for varying surface area. So these were just steel balls. This one is 1/16 inch in radius, and our smallest and then our biggest was 1 inch radius. This one had about 0.3 newtons of force, and then that one applied about 80 newtons of force. It would move back and forth collecting data as it would go. So from here, we were looking at friction and lubrication. So cartilage is an viscoelastic solid, meaning it acts as a solid and a liquid. And so we were looking at which lubrication methods it was using, when, and how. So from here, this was our data. Over here is our carpus data, and this is our stifle data. So we found something very cool in our data. As you can tell about the slope change right about here for all the different balls, it started out in a Hertz regime of pressure, which meant that pressure was relieved in the X, Y, and Z direction, and then transferred to a Winkler's pressure regime, which meant that the pressure was so intense that there was only relief in the X direction. So it meant that there was no longer boundary lubrication acting with the cartilage. It was just becoming a viscoelastic solid and acting as a solid to withstand these high forces, and it can be seen in the stifle data too. From here, this was the third part of my internship. This was an ileal impaction research. An ileal impaction is when you basically have a bowel obstruction or just clogged pipes, simplest way to put it. It was a retrospective study, so we would look at old case files and check off determinants like surgery, what the surgeon did, what worked, what didn't work, if they survived, if they died, to see what does and does not work for ileal impaction. So the cool thing about both of these research opportunities is there are research papers, and because of it, I was able to get my name on both. So the final part of my internship was philanthropy-based. I worked at Storybook Farms in Alabama, and we helped underprivileged youth and also disabled youth through equine therapy and sensitivity training with horses, miniature horses, goats, cats, everything. And so in my free time, I went to Lake Martin, Taquarita. I didn't have much free time. And then my advice for future pinheads is to take full advantage of the minds that you're around. You're around some incredibly smart people, and even if you're paying attention in the smallest conversations, I promise you will still learn something. And then also bring a notebook, because you will be that person in the back of the room, like scribbling everything down. And then these are my thank yous.